Hi everyone, thanks for inviting me out and thanks for coming. I'm going to tell you about some research that's been collaborative work with the Tsimane Health and Life History Project. So our project has been investigating whether the age profiles of skill development across the lifespan correspond to some predictions from life history theory about the timing of productivity and reproduction. And life history models, in particular the embodied capital model of life history evolution, suggests that the really long human lifespan and our large brains have co-evolved in foraging niches where survival and fitness depended on downward transfers of resources and multi-generational family structures, and also learning of really complex, difficult skills that take a lot of information accumulation. And so previous tests of these models have focused on the productivity and provisioning of energetic resources, so food. And what I'm doing, I'm expanding on the scope of inquiry to consider not just the energetic resources, but also informational resources. So outline of what I ambitiously am going to try to do in the next hopefully less than an hour, is go over some general research questions that tie this together. I'm going to tell you about the Tsimane, the Forager Horticulturalists group in the Bolivian Amazon, who's my study sample. And I have two studies that I'm going to present. The first one is based on a skills survey that asks about ages of acquisition and proficiency and expertise in a whole bunch of skills, which I'll tell you about, and also borrows on a whole bunch of other information that we've collected in the project. We have census information on a majority of this really big population, demographic work, we know about kinship relationships. I've been involved in a lot of mapping, as have others, so we have geolocated the residences of where people lived at the time of the study. We have food production and consumption data, which is really nice because that kind of complements the report data that comes from surveys, which I'll be presenting. And I've been involved in a lot of ethnography to understand their culture, their way of life. So I'll get through the predictions and analyses and results and summarize what I found out with study one. And then the second study is based on a kind of follow-up survey with the people who reported knowing these traditional stories from my first study. And this is, so it's focused on this traditional story survey, which got me information about what stories people know, which of those stories that they know that they tell, and who their primary sources when they learn those stories were. And then I'll go through predictions, analyses, results, and summarize what we found out from the second study, and then try to wrap it up. Okay, so the overarching questions that I have are, why do humans have this really long, slow lifespan? And some of the features of a long, slow lifespan to call attention to are that we have a really long period of juvenile development and a long post-reproductive survival, as you know, I'm sure. And the development of our productive skills takes a really long time, and that's also a unique feature of humans, especially compared to other primates. And so, given that these are our unique life history features, I'm curious about how the long evolved lifespan in humans shapes the way that we learn from one another and the development of what I like to refer to as human capital. So there's this concept in economics that Gary Becker kind of coined, at least in that domain, about human capital, and that's kind of how you have this value that can be a value to firms, to businesses, to society. And when we're thinking in an evolutionary biology way, I like to also think about human capital, but I would reframe it as your value to contribute to inclusive fitness. So I think we can think about both of those definitions of human capital. And so some more specific questions I have about skill development and learning include, at what ages do people acquire skills? I'm going to kind of operationalize some of these bolded terms in just a moment. when do people report being most proficient with the skills that they have? And at what age do people recognize expertise in themselves and others, especially others? And then finally, because it's kind of a curiosity, especially one that I'm very interested in about this especially long lifespan and what's going on with older post-reproductive adults, I'm interested in figuring out what are the latest skills to develop in life and what might be the explanations for why those skills are developing so late, if we can identify some. Okay, so I'll tell you a little bit about the study population and location. So the Tsimane are a group of about 15,000 people. They've been growing rapidly, and they are located in the Bolivian Amazon, in the upper Amazon. This is kind of the foothills, these ridges you see, the foothills of the Andes. So here's South America, green country is Bolivia here, so zooming into Bolivia. And then this red box is this kind of Tsimane territory. In the middle of it, we have a market center with non-indigenous people called San Borja. There's a road that cuts through San Borja. This part can often be unpassable during the rainy season. And then these are other logging roads, which a good portion of the year, even during dry season, can be impassable because they're not maintained. And there's a major river that runs through this area, and there's tributaries to it that don't show up on this map so well. And so the circles here are proportionally sized circles to the populations that we've measured in the towns. They don't actually represent anything spatial. But these little specks in there are the locations of the residences. So you can kind of see, like along the river, you see that they kind of splay out along the direction of the river because people are trying to be close to that resource, the water. The towns that have the red outlines on them are the study villages in my research project. Okay, so I'll give you some more information about the Tsimane, because what I'm going to do now is kind of introduce, kind of as a little photo slideshow. I developed this skills survey with, ultimately we ended up researching 92 different skills which we thought were essential to survival and the way of life of the Tsimane. And so I'll kind of break it out by domains that they cluster into. I won't go through each of those skills because that would be kind of too slow. But so here's the one way to look at it. There's a lot of ways to reorganize, make categories and macro categories out of these skills, but these are some useful ones to think about. And I'll show you some pictures. So food production, first of all, I can quickly say that about 98% of what Tsimane eat is coming from what you see up here: hunting, fishing, gardening, and only 2% is market-acquired sources of things like sugar, salt that's bought, or oil. So those are kind of rare treats for them. Let's see, then there's down here, these household chores and the manufacture of things like tools and everyday objects. I'm also kind of clustering these things into these bigger categories. So just some conceptual organization for you, because I'll be using these different labels throughout the presentation of results. So here comes some photos. Here's some hunters going out on the trail. Unlike the Amazonians that I've done research with and joined Clark in the field visiting the Shuar, the Amazonians use blowguns often, along with guns, but they use bow and arrow and they don't use blowguns. And so the guy there has his kit of bows and arrows. He's also got a shotgun and a machete, and he's got a marica, which is a hand-woven bag that both men and women use for carrying things. Fishing, people will fish with hook and line, nets, bow and arrow, barbasco, which is the fish poisoning. They practice slash and burn agriculture, clearing garden spaces where there's trees growing, and plant things like manioc or yucca, corn. You see rice down there. There's the main tool, as you probably know, in many small-scale societies is a machete, but using an axe and pulling a canoe or other kinds of tool use that I investigated. And there's a bunch of food processing skills, some shown here, like smoking food or processing grains. There you see a girl who's using a pounder, probably to pound rice, to dehusk it, with her sibs looking on. And then we investigated a number of skills related to reproduction and childcare, and then various chores and crafts skills, such as maintaining a fire in a house, bringing water to the house, building the house. As you see, the guy there is working on a roof. People also make these woven palm panels that they will sell, if they have excess of, to the market. And that's one of the few things that they kind of engage with the market economy with, is making those palm panels. And then if they earn some money from those, they may buy machetes or medicine or alcohol, something like that are common purchases. There's a lady making one of those Marika purses that I mentioned. And then I investigated a bunch of musical skills and things in the oral tradition, like telling stories. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that, especially when I get into the second study. And then there's a number of skills related to social interaction, like being a leader, punishing people when somebody needs to met out punishment, selling things in the market or to the market. So these, just a broad overview with some pictures to kind of give you a sense of who these people are and some of the things that I'm looking into. There's some of those Hatata panels, and you see them on rafts that were going downstream to be sold to merchants near the market center. So let me tell you some specifics about how I collected data and then the type of variables that I'll be analyzing. I'm going to use this. Okay, so I started out with open-ended surveys. I had these semi-structured interviews where when I went in, I'd read what I could about the Tsimane, talked to all my colleagues, but being kind of new to the area, I also wanted to just ask open-ended questions and explore what people produced as their ideas of what were essential and important skills. And so what I did is I conducted 22 of these semi-structured interviews with adults 20 to 72 years old, and got a big set of skills. 101 skills emerged out of that. Then I got together a panel of research assistants that were men and women. They were, most of them were spouses, had 12 of them, and we worked for a while kind of talking through that set of 101 skills and refining it. They added some things, we got rid of some things, and we ended up with a set of 92 skills that we decided to use for this survey. They help with the categorization, some of what I showed to you, those kind of categories. And they also helped with a rating of whether or not those skills required substantial strength or didn't require a lot of strength to carry out. And then to train the research assistants who helped me with the interviews, because some people speak only Tsimane, and I'm not very fluent with Tsimane. I know some, but can't really get by that well. And I speak Spanish, so I was carrying out interviews in Spanish, and I'd always have a research assistant with me, and so when I could, I'd carry out the interview. When they could, they would in Tsimane. And we went into a village which isn't included in my sample, and we piloted these interviews for a week or a couple weeks in this village to get a feel for how things would go, what trouble was, how we had to adapt the question and data recording process. And then we felt like we were ready to actually do the real thing, collect the data. So ultimately, we ended up in those 8 villages that were outlined in the map, sampling 421 Tsimane. Was a full coverage in those 8 villages. The age ranges are 18 to 86. And the questions that we asked them is, for each of these 92 skills, for the sex-appropriate skills, because there is a big division of labor by sex in the population. We asked them if it was a sex-appropriate skill, are you in the habit of and able to use a machete, for example? And then they'll either say yes or no, and we coded the no's as 0 and the yeses as 1. If it was a yes, then we had a series of follow-up questions. If it was a no, then we moved on to the next skill on the interview. And the follow-up questions were, if you know it, how do you know how to do this well, this skill, like use an axe, for example? And so we gave them 3 options as responses: not so well, more or less, and very well. Very few people, less than 1% of our sample, use not so well, so we combined those responses with the more or less, and we just used 0-1 coding to analyze that data. So that's people's self-reports of their own proficiency. We asked them about, at what age did you acquire the basic competence with this skill, to do it without instruction, without supervision, without delegation? And they gave us responses to that. To the people who weren't really comfortable in a numerate way to produce ages, we had a photograph age scale where they have some kind of indigenous concepts of age grades, and they would use those, but those would kind of be like life stage labels, and then we would hone in using photos. They were from people outside the sample, so that they could get more accurate estimates of when they first acquired those skills. And then we asked people to nominate, and they could provide us up to 3 nominations, including themselves. Who is the best of all the people that you know? And we didn't restrict it beyond that. Who's the best at this skill? And then they would give us a name, which we later identified in our census and figured out who those people were and relationships and all that. And then we asked them also about the performance difficulty of that skill. Is it difficult to do this? Which is somewhat of a general question, but they didn't have much trouble with that. And we also had this learning difficulty question. Does it take a long time to learn? And they could answer one of these 3 responses. So the stuff in red up here is basically the type of variables that I'll be reporting data on. Okay, so what I'm going to now tell you about is kind of my overarching perspective, overarching hypotheses that I'll have specific predictions on the next slides, but my overarching hypotheses about how I kind of approach what I expect. So skill development in this kind of society, which is a natural fertility ecology, meaning there's no birth control, women are almost always reproductive during that reproductive stage of their life. How skills develop, I expect to correspond with some functional kind of proximate life goals that are specific to the pre-reproductive life stage, and so and the reproductive and post-reproductive life stage. So the proximate goals for the pre-reproductive life stage are to acquire basic competence with the skill set to support yourself eventually, because clearly kids can't do that, but they want to get there, right? To eventually attract and secure a mate. If you can't do stuff and you can't be a supportive person who wants to marry you. And so that's often going to require demonstrating the first goal. And then in the reproductive life stage, these things should be really obvious, I think. You need to reproduce, and you need to be able to produce to not only take care of yourself, but to take care of your offspring, using those skills so that you're eventually, fitness isn't just about reproductive success. It's about ensuring the reproductive success of your offspring as well and all your kin, right? So you want your offspring to be able to accomplish these goals as well. So that's kind of part of one of these major goals of the reproductive life stage. And then in the post-reproductive life stage, as you're still taking, after you've had your last offspring, there's still going to be another 18 to 20 years that you're taking care of that last offspring before they can achieve these goals. So even though I'm kind of operationalizing the post-reproductive life stage as post-menopause for women, and because we know that on average, men's last reproductive event is tied to their wife's, that's what I'm calling that life stage, basically after 45 for men and women. But there's still kind of reproductive goals that are going on there. So post-reproductive parents need to continue making contributions towards their kin fulfilling those goals, despite the senescence that they're experiencing and the loss of strength and other declines in productivity. Okay, so a little bit about some theory now, life history theory about the pre-reproductive life stage. So general life history models, like some introduced by Eric Charnoff, have suggested that energy is reallocated towards reproduction once sexual maturity is hit in the lifespan, and the amount of effort that goes into foraging increases on the way leading up to reproduction. And then when you get to reproduction, that effort is supposed to basically, according to these basic models, plateau. And you're not, according to these models, supposed to really be getting any better at your productivity. But we know that that's clearly not the case for humans. Peaks in different forms of productivity come well after the beginning of the reproductive stage. By the way, these models work really well for non-humans in general. They explain a lot of the variability in life history traits among animals. Also, we know that with humans, growth is really slow in childhood until there's this adolescent growth spurt. So that's another kind of interesting thing, that physical growth is being delayed for a good part of the pre-reproductive period. And children are across societies relatively protected and free of responsibility, and usually not asked to engage in things that are really dangerous and require tons of exertion, and usually supported almost, at times exclusively by adult surplus food production. Now there are various populations where researchers, so Karen Kramer, John Bach have done studies where they show that kids can be quite helpful in some environments, but it's usually where the form of production that kids can engage in is relatively easy, and it doesn't have huge risks and potential morbidity and mortality costs. With the Tsimane, safety and strength considerations basically preclude children from being able to do the kind of productive things that adults do. So they can't reasonably be expected to go out hunting and working in gardens where there's dangers with snakes and so on. What else? Females are becoming mothers at around age 18 and fathers about 2 years later. So the first prediction, specifically about the timing of skills in the pre-reproductive life stage, is basically that we expect that the reported age of acquisition for most of the food production and child rearing and craft production skills, so basically the skill set that you want to be able to demonstrate to be somewhat self-sufficient, and also look like a good mate prospect, that these things should be acquired prior to adulthood, prior to the time that you want to start a family. So here's some of the data from this acquisition data. This is for females. I'll show you males on the next slide. So broken up into those macro categories. Basically, this is proportion of the skills that they're reporting. The cumulative percent is mapped, and ages down here. The dashed lines, this is kind of the pre-reproductive period. So you see that we see that basic competence in most of these skills, well above 75%, is acquired by age 18 for females. And for males, it's pretty similar, delayed 2 years, but more or less the same result. Okay, so moving on to the reproductive life stage. Okay, so we know that when you become an adult, you're already starting to, aging starts pretty much right away. And so strength is already starting to decline gradually from the 20s on. Yet other forms of embodied capital like experience and knowledge, they can keep accumulating. So the inner birth interval for the Tsimane is 2.6 years. Their total fertility rate, meaning the number of surviving offspring, is 9, so super high, meaning that both of those things kind of put in consideration means that women are always, from 18 to menopause, are always engaged in some kind of reproductive chore, whether it's pregnancy, nursing, childcare, repeating that again and again over the 9 offspring. And as your family size grows, you have more mouths to feed, right? And more food to put on the table. Of course, when your oldest kids are approaching 18, they start to produce a little bit, so their demands start to decrease a little bit. Of course, they're also hungrier too. But I'll show you on the next slide how the demands map out. But basically, just to kind of keep in mind, the peak of offspring demands for the typical Tsimane family peaks around age 34. That's when you need to put the most food on the table for your offspring. So the predictions that I've generated for this stage is that performance for child rearing and food production skills should be highest around the time of greatest offspring dependency. And informant's self-ratings of proficiency, how well they think they are at those skills, should match the performance peaks. So for performance, I'm going to look at that food production data, which is kind of more of an objective measure and not self-report, but I'll compare it to the self-report data about how good people think they are. And the next prediction is during the reproductive life stage, the likelihood of being nominated an expert for food production skills requiring strength, because some require strength, others don't. For the food production skills requiring strength, it'll be higher than for those that don't require strength. But also during this reproductive life stage, because strength is declining, the performance in the non-strength requiring food production skills should be rising at a faster rate as people adjust to these changes in strength declines. So first, looking at the results that support the first prediction. This is cool data. So what we have here is this trend line with the circles is basically the amount of food you need to put on the table to meet those consumption demand needs, the net consumption demands of your kids. So this is subtracting out, because it's net, what they produce themselves. As I said, it's around age 34 when you're at the peak. And for the average parent, net production after their own consumption requirements is mapped up here. Oh no, this is gross production. So then net production after they've eaten what they need to eat is mapped here. And you'll get a little bit more with 2 parents, obviously. And so we see, the main takeaway here is that the peak in what parents are producing, it's kind of tracking this curve, but it's a little bit delayed too, right? So some of that I think is explained by the fact that the grandparents are helping their children when they're young parents. And so it's not just the parents are feeding their offspring, but you have this downward transfer of energetic food resources that go through multiple generations. And the Tsimane project has a number of papers that have demonstrated this really nicely. So here we see people's self-ratings of when they think they were very proficient, when they thought they were great, at food production and child rearing skills. Both are kind of looked at together in this graph, and over here it's just the food production skills. And then I have that kind of objective measure from gross caloric production that I showed you on the last graph. Like over here, you can compare basically the self-reports to those kind of objective reports where we were collecting and weighing food and looking at consumption and all that. And what we basically see, this is a nice finding because I think we all should be skeptical about survey self-report data. How do you know that people are giving you good information? So we're able to compare these self-reports to another type of data, the objective, what I like to call more objective actual measures of food production. And over here, I'm kind of lumping in the food production and child rearing skills, and you see that it also follows that trend. Okay, moving on. The next prediction was about during the reproductive life stage that the likelihood of being nominated as an expert for food production skills requiring strength would be higher for those skills with minimal strength requirement. No, will be higher than those with minimal strength requirements. So the ones requiring strength is what you'll get more nominations as being an expert for. But also that during this reproductive life stage, the rate of nominations for those low strength skills will be increasing faster because basically you're adjusting to your declines in productivity. So I need to kind of take a little detour in presenting results to just kind of give you a brief overview about how we're getting at this expertise nomination data. So I'll try to get through this quickly. Here, so we had, from our sample, 421 people who we're calling judges. They're nominating people as experts. And so they could potentially nominate people from within that set of judges, but they also nominated 176 people that weren't in our survey set. So altogether, the potential targets, we're considering 597 potential targets that are being nominated by 421 judges. And our model is, well, this is just kind of descriptive. Here you see the accumulation of the proportion of nominations that each of those targets gets. On the blue line, if it was a Poisson distribution, it would be the kind of null hypothesis according to a Poisson distribution is the green line. And if everyone got the same amount of nominations, you'd see something like the red line. Okay, so a little bit about some of the things that are affecting nominations that we had to consider in our model before we kind of had our downstream metric. So most people are nominating targets of who they think the most expert is in a skill. They're nominating people in their own village. Okay, as you can see going down the diagonal here, these are the rows are the judges. The targets are on the columns. So almost all the nominations are within village. Here is kind of a satellite image of where one of the bigger villages is. And I've drawn lines. I don't have arrows showing which way the nominations were going, but it doesn't matter because it's so busy of an image anyway. Just to give you a sense of where the judges and targets are connecting. So you can do your visual inspection here. So this is for all of the nominations. And you only see a few lines that are kind of leaving the village, right? Consistent with what I showed you on the last figure. Here's for just nominations of expertise in machete, the blue, and then the yellow are like kind of what was left over from that last slide.
Quick question.
Yes, please.
Across the different skills, one might imagine that some are more appropriate for the expertise question than others.
Yeah, so that's, you're like here I just switched to loom rods, which is a super rare skill in our population. So actually this wasn't worthy of inclusion in this kind of metric of consensus expertise nominations because there wasn't enough data to get reliable measures of the nominations. So we had to throw out like 15 of those 91 skills for this kind of data set.
But presumably you're throwing them out at both ends. That is, there's some skills that are so mundane that there are no meaningful differences.
Yeah. So exactly. So there's the rare ones and then the mundane ones. So like Butchering an animal was one of the ones we threw out, and breastfeeding was another one we threw out. Because when we asked people who's the most expert at this, they just looked at us like, that's a crazy question. What do you mean? Like, who's the most expert at butchering an animal? We all do a good job. You know, like, and we consistently got those responses for a discrete set of skills, where it became really clear after 400 interviews over all these skills that there were some that just didn't work. So those 15 got knocked out. Yeah, good intuition there. Also, the other kind of thing that might kind of confound the counts of frequency of being nominated is that people are nominating. You already saw the spatial kind of confound, right? People are nominating people close to them. They're nominating even more within residential clusters, even more within their household. And that relates to this, which is that if you look at the relatedness, whether it's along affinal dimensions or consanguinal dimensions of kinship, that the closer people are related to you or to your spouse, the more likely they are to be nominated. Okay, so what we ended up doing to kind of adjust for these things is first, we created this model that had two stages to it. Because the nominations are clearly inflated by spatial and kinship relations, where larger towns and residential clusters and where there's more kin, people are getting more nominations, and it's not necessarily indicative that they're more expert. We had the first stage of this logit model was looking at the counts that are due just to those relational factors. And from that, we kind of partialed out the residual, which then we used for the second stage of the model, which was to look at what we wanted to get at, which is the social consensus expertise. So I'm kind of glossing over the details of this, but in the interest of time, I want to get back to the data. How am I doing on time? Not that well. Okay. So here is expertise data for food production skills for females on the left and males on the right. And it's zeroed at age 35. That's where it crosses the 0 on the y-axis in all cases of this kind of data that I'll present. And what we're showing is the log odds change in the proportion of nominations that people receive given their age from that kind of baseline of age 35. This is just a kind of meaningful way to look at the change in expertise nominations that people receive. So we're able to, I'm plotting the results for those food production skills that don't require strength and the ones that do. And we're able to, with those two trend lines, look at differences in height using statistical tests and differences in slope. And I have those coded with these kind of hash marks and gray backgrounds. So the results are that the likelihood of being nominated an expert for the high strength skills is higher during the reproductive ages. So here's reproductive ages, and the heights differ. It's the kind of gray background, but those are significantly different, and there too. During the reproductive ages, also the likelihood of being nominated for the low strength skills, which is lower, it's increasing at a faster rate. The slope is significantly different than for the skills requiring strength. So people are getting more and more nominations of being expert in those low strength skills as they get older, which is presumably this life history strategy to compensate for the declines in strength, because you can't keep working at the things that you're getting worse and worse at. And we also see that at the oldest ages, out in the post-reproductive range there, but at the right edge of it, that slopes are different again, and the likelihood of being nominated an expert for low strength skills is higher for both men and women. And the peak ages, which are represented with those dashes, where we could identify the statistically significant peaks, for low strength skills are late in the post-reproductive period. So skills not requiring strength, but food-producing skills, that's what you get the most nominations for as a female and a male in the post-reproductive period. Okay, so now the predictions about the post-reproductive life stage, so a little background. So as I mentioned, strength continues to decline, But experience and knowledge continues to increase. So these are kind of neat features that we should keep in consideration and which lead us to the predictions. The highest levels of very proficient self-evaluations and also the expert nominations that people receive in low-strength skills that are unrelated to food production should be delayed until after the offspring provisioning demand is greatest. So what I'm thinking about is things like making crafts and telling stories, things that aren't the food-producing skills. Those can be delayed until after the bulk of the burden of provisioning has been passed. And with age, post-reproductive adults' reported skill sets are increasingly composed of most difficult skills and skills requiring only minimal strength. That reflects the kind of strength and knowledge requirements and what they can offer. And then the last prediction for this stage of life is that in the post-reproductive life stage, expertise in traditional pedagogy, which in this society it has been via music and storytelling, the oral tradition, will be increasingly recognized with age. Okay, so some results. Here you see the expertise metrics for males and females. For this is very proficient self-evaluations for low-strength skills unrelated to food production. And also you see the self-reports of proficiency. There weren't any sex differences, so we show it for males and females together there. So both of them tell this story that these low-strength skills unrelated to food production are peaking late in life. And also another thing to point out is that these self-reports of proficiency and the other reports of expertise, they agree. So that's nice. Before I was showing you that the objective measures of where we had it of performance for like food production agreed with the expertise data. Here you see that the self-reports and the reports of others also agree. So it's nice that we can kind of triangulate between these different kinds of information. It gives us a little more confidence about the data we've collected. Okay, and here you see the changes in the shares of skills that people are reporting based on the strength requirements of those skills on the left two panels and based on the difficulty requirements of those skills in the right two panels. So basic story here is that skills requiring a lot of strength, people report less and less having those skills as they get older. And skills that are really difficult, and that's a composite measure of difficulty across that learning difficulty and the other kind of difficulty I mentioned. Those more difficult skills, people are reporting more of them with age. And this is I think this is the prettiest graph of them all, probably because of the colors. And this shows those macro categories of skills and the expertise nominations. So it's cool because this kind of also gets at that question of which skills are the ones that people are being recognized for expert latest in life. And look at the purple line, music and storytelling. The oral tradition is just get more and more recognition as an expert for that up till the very last stages. And so the last one is the two sexes. This is females and this is males. Okay, so just to summarize the results, and then I'll try to get quickly through the second study. So Tsimane have a self-awareness that's really accurate about their own skill development and the skill development of others. And we have a lot of agreement between the different kinds of data. And so this is clearly important for kind of social awareness and comparison and competition and learning and pedagogy, cooperation, exchange. You want to know who's good at what, and you want to accurately know how good you are at stuff. They also, as I mentioned, they have this indigenous terminology of age stages that also fits our data. And their acquisition of these essential skills I showed is there by the beginning of reproductive adulthood. And you see that the child rearing skills develop as the demands of your children accumulate. And at the latest ages, you see that the peak proficiency and expertise is for these low strength but high skill activities that are really difficult that complement food production. So especially music and storytelling. So these things are well predicted by strength and knowledge changes at different ages. Okay, so I can move on to the next study quickly. Maybe I can do this in 10, 15 minutes, and if there's no questions here. Okay, so this is a follow-up study with that same sample of people, but with a more restricted sample, which is the people who are the story knowledgeable informants. I ended up asking them about their knowledge of each of 120 stories, and if they knew those stories, if they tell those stories to others. This set of stories, I developed a list with Tomas Wanka, who's been working on this topic for a number of years. He's been working with the other Tsimane project that has affiliations with some folks at Northwestern and elsewhere in Brandeis. And also with a key informant who Wanka's worked with, who's a Tsimane, who's been involved in documenting folklore. So anyway, let's see. People also told us the primary sources of who they learned the stories that they knew from. And we also were estimating the potential audiences that these storytellers had, how big the younger kin audiences were in their residential clusters, how big the potential audiences in their villages are. So a little background about music and storytelling. As I mentioned before, it's kind of the traditional pedagogy, since they don't have formal education like we do. That's how a lot of important information's been transmitted. And it's really crucial to well-being and ultimately to fitness, because a lot of the skills that people acquire, or let's say a lot of the knowledge that people acquire through these stories, I mean, maybe you could acquire them also just through discussion and through hearing what people have to say. And it's not only through the stories that people learn, but this is stuff that it's costly to figure it out on your own. And so, you know, you might die learning that a tiger's bad or something like that. So it's good to get a lot of this information vicariously through exposure to stories. People tend to tell stories a lot when they have the opportunity to drink chicha, their fermented manioc beer. Music and stories kind of go hand in hand. There's often music at parties at the village level, which go along with the drink. And also just in residences at night, when people are done with their workday and they're gathered around the fire, that's when they're often doing a little music or telling stories or just joking around. So I investigated the kind of formal traditional repertoire of stories, but there's also people telling just their experiences, and both are very commonly found. And the same with music. There's traditional repertoire of music, and then people also do a kind of improvisation, which I can tell you more about later if you're interested. So we know little about the developmental timing of people learning and eventually producing this kind of storytelling. And the transmission patterns of how people, who they tell stories to and who they learn them from. And a question that I've had, I mean, we know that oral tradition, that people are being recognized as experts late in life, but I was kind of curious, are the experts the ones who are still really good at a lot of stuff? Is it the ones who are the guys who just have a lot, and women who have a lot going on? They're the most recognized as storytellers? Or is it people who have actually experienced a lot of declines in their other forms of production, that this is kind of like a last-ditch effort to be productive, and so they kind of develop more of their storytelling ability? So the complement perspective is you're already good at a lot of other things, and that should be predictive of being doing more storytelling. And the supplement perspective or hypothesis is that you're kind of it's like a replacement of your other abilities and forms of production. So some predictions, pretty basic stuff, like there should be age increases in the number of stories you know. Age should predict the numbers of stories you tell. Clearly, the more stories you know, the more stories you can tell, so there should be a relationship between those. And because, as we find out, stories known predicts stories told. I end up later for these predictions looking at what I call storytelling propensity. It's basically the propensity to tell the stories given the amount of stories you know. So like the proportional storytelling kind of. Right, so this is the supplementary hypothesis, and the second one, the complementary hypothesis. And was curious whether the size of the recipient audiences, whether it was younger kin in the household and or just people generally in the villages, whether that was predictive of storytelling. And I have some predictions about this, the story sources that were nominated, and we treat that a little bit like those expert nominations in terms of how we dealt with the data. But whether people are nominating same sex, as we see with a lot of the expert nominations, whether it's closer kin that are favored to learn stories from. And this is an interesting one, whether it's non-parents who are closer kin, same sex, so like a grandparent over a parent, if grandparents are represented even more. The age findings that I already showed you for oral tradition, and also this was one of my intuitions, and who is it? Radcliffe Brown has this idea about, I have it in my notes here. Yeah, alternate generations, that people feel sometimes more comfortable with the relationships with their grandparents than they do with their parents, because there's, parent-offspring conflicts, and you're tired of your parents always telling you what to do. So maybe getting some of this information, it's just more appealing to hear a story from your grandparent than your parent. So anyway, some descriptive results really quick. So we did this survey with the 54 story knowledgeable people from our original skills survey sample, and that's 13% of that sample. How many stories did the average story knowledgeable informant know? 32.3, which is about 27% of the inventory of stories that we queried them about. And how many stories did they tell? They told the majority, 65% of the stories they knew. The average repertoire, or the range of a storyteller's repertoire went from 0. Some people knew stories, I think 1 or 2, but told none. Some the mavens tell almost all the stories they know, and they know almost all of them. But on 96% of the people told at least 1 or more story. And then who was most nominated just in terms of counts? It was grandparents. 38% of nominations were for grandparents, where only 30% were for parents, and then the rest of the breakdowns there. So people are really curious when I tell them about this data, about the content of the stories. I looked into it. I have that here, but there's not a lot to say about it. So stories contain foraging information and social information, and most stories, so the total amount of stories out of my 120, so we categorize them into these non-exclusive story categories about having that kind of fitness-relevant information. And then these are the specific types of stories. There's a whole set of stories that have felines, other ones that are about cosmology and origin kind of stories, eschatology. Then there's fables with these kind of imaginary animal-like creatures. Stories with creator beings. There's stories that are kind of rooted in actual events that are historical. But anyway, I think this is kind of what people often, their heads go to with adaptive explanations of storytelling. Is there this fitness enhancing information? And most stories have both types of things, social information and foraging information. Okay, so let me move on. So here is among the set of 54 people, scatter plots and mean regression lines for the number of stories known on the left and the number of stories told on the right. When we look at the number of stories known and we consider that full set of 421 people, there is like an age-sex interaction, but it's not so big, and you barely see it here. But number of stories told, there is a bigger age-sex interaction where the rate of increase of stories told is increasing more rapidly for females than for males. Okay, so some results. So we see that older adults know more stories. I have a regression table here where I have models where I evaluated more and more independent variables. Age first, you see that there's an age effect. You see that there's a sex effect where males know more stories than females. There's that interaction effect, but it's not really too noteworthy. And we also see that people who are more integrated into the market economy tell more stories, and also people who are further travel distance from the market tell more stories. And I bet you'd get very different results of these variables if you were looking at. So this is with the full sample. It's not what I plotted on the last graph. This is the 421 people, all the zeros of I don't know the traditional stories. Only 54 did. These, I think, look different when you just look at the 54 people. Okay, so storytelling propensity. This is a negative binomial regression that's set up in event trials format. So where the event is telling the story, and then the trial is whether you know the story or not. So it's basically the proportion of known stories told, or storytelling propensity. And we see that there is a, let's see, what's interesting here is this comparative, there's no effect of overall expertise. So this doesn't support the notion that storytelling is complementary to ability in all other domains. But there is an effect of comparative advantage in just the oral tradition domain. So that means that you're really good at that compared to your ability in all the other domains, according to those expertise nominations. So people who have comparative advantage, meaning less opportunity costs because they're not missing out on doing all those other things that they're really bad at, they're the ones who are telling more of the stories they know. And then the audience sizes don't really matter for the most part. Okay, and then this is showing you the nomination propensity, the nomination probability, the number of observed nominations for possible targets given the kinship of the between the nominator and the target. And basically, this is a similar result to what we saw before, where people who are closer in kinship, whether it's affinal, this is all, is this? No, this is both, yeah. This is like before, I showed you a figure before. This is kind of a tabular representation. I could show it as columns, but this shows whether there's data. In some cases, there was just no data. But basically, the main takeaway here is that the closer people are related, the closer kin they are, the more likely they are to be nominated. Now, this regression table is also looking at nomination probability, and we see that most people are saying that they learn these stories primarily from older close kin. That's what I call a vertical transmitter. It's a kin who's an older adult, so from parent, grandparent, uncle, that kind of thing. And same-sex transmission is what we see. And the closer the kin is, that predicts or learning from those storytellers. And then we also see that in model 5 here that the non-parental kin are significant predictors of being who you learn stories from, but not parents. So that goes along with this finding that yes, it is these basically grandparents, or it could be a great uncle or something like that, but grandparents are the most commonly observed nomination who people are learning their stories from. Okay, so let me just wrap up. We see that age, these are the same predictions. I'm just putting up green check marks or red X's depending on what we found. age is predictive of people knowing stories and telling stories, and the propensity to tell the stories that they know. We have evidence for a kind of supplementary explanation of storytelling, that it's a replacement for other forms of production, and so people who have comparative advantage and few opportunity costs tell stories more, but not necessarily people who are great at everything, because presumably they would have more opportunity costs. The audience sizes didn't predict storytelling propensity. And then we see that it's same-sex, closer kin, and people who are older than the informants, and especially these grandparents, so non-parental older same-sex kin who are being nominated as story sources. So just a little bit discussion about these findings. So we see that in the population, whereas most of the skills I presented with the first study, most people had most skills, storytelling is one of the highly specialized skills among the Tsimane. And men have an overall greater and more rapid decline in food production. We know this from the food production data. Men's peak level of food production is around age 45, where they're producing about 4,000 calories a day. But by age 80, men are down to basically zero. So maybe the fact that men are learning more stories in this population could be a kind of life history strategy to be able to build up this knowledge so that you can be better poised to be a storyteller to buffer those declines in productivity. Now with women, we see that they produce a little bit, their trend of food production is slightly different. They peak at 3,000 calorie a day production at age 55, and men are about the same at age 55 with the same amount of production, but they don't go down to zero at 80. At 80, they're still producing on average 1,000 calories a day. So they have a little bit of a later peak than men do, and then a little bit less of a drastic decline. So they're not learning as much stories throughout life because maybe they have more opportunity costs, but then as they're approaching older age, they're ramping up their propensity to tell the stories that they do know, which could be reflecting still a buffering kind of approach to making up for their other losses. And kind of a broader level of discussion, people who've looked at labor markets have found that in terms of productivity of adults in different kinds of jobs, that where problem solving and learning and speed is needed. It's unfortunate, that we all grow old and get worse at stuff. You see the productivity declines across a lot of kinds of jobs where those are the requirements. It decreases from 50 years of age easily on. But for the kinds of jobs where older workers especially are dependent or using verbal abilities, those are the kinds of jobs where you see older adults maintaining productivity for the longest. I think what we see even in modern labor markets and modern societies and economies still reflects some of the life history traits that I think are evolved and found, in all different populations among humans. So just 2 points to conclude on. So as I told you, what I've been doing is looking at a more complete set of skills beyond just food production, but also, crafts and the transmission of information. And this survey highlights that the development of non-caloric production skills and services matures pretty late in life, and later than those other peaks that people have been concentrating on in terms of parenting skills and food production skills. And this is important for this life history perspective of downward transfers, and thinking that the downward transfers that you need to get aren't just about food and stuff, but also about information. This supports basically the embodied capital model of human life history evolution, where a long life evolves in this difficult feeding niche with a multi-generation extended family structure and this net resource flow from older to younger. So thanks for your interest. This is my thanks to my collaborator co-authors here for those different studies. And then I had a big team of really hardworking anthropologists, Tsimane anthropologists in the field, and funding. Thanks, and I'll leave you with this picture. So. Thanks, Sue. Thank you. Dan.
So I probably could have done a better job of this question a few years ago, but, oh well, so choosing partners for a variety of activities, you want to distinguish between knowledge and productivity. So if I'm deciding who I want in a collective work group, right, party or something like that.
Planners, doers, yeah.
Yeah, I want somebody who is going to produce, but if I'm deciding who do I want to learn from, right, then I'm happy to choose somebody whose productivity is low, potentially, but their expertise is high. Now, maybe because you presented really rich data really quickly, I missed it, or maybe it's just a question of nomenclature, but it seemed to me that in your evaluations of what you were calling expertise, where people self-rated their proficiency and they nominated others as experts, that there was a conflation of what we might call productivity and knowledge, right? So
yeah, so
if we ask
with those categories, I definitely agree, and I'm able to kind of hone in a little bit more into what you're talking about because I have higher resolution if I'm looking at specific skills.
Okay.
And I think that's future work that needs to be done because you're bringing up a really good point.
Because when we look, for example, there were two things that jumped out. So one was the role of strength in, for example, food production, right? And the other was childcare. So childcare expertise, as you were mapping it, seemed to decline in later life. And that simply can't be true, right? Because it must be the case that if by expertise you mean, knowledge, absent the ability to actually perform, right? Just knowledge, qua knowledge. The longer you've been alive, the more children you've seen and taken care of and heard about, the more you know about how to take care of children. But, for example, you may have a harder time chasing them around the village. You may not be capable of nursing anymore. There are all kinds of other things that could impact them.
Right, and again, it was an average that I was reporting with those trend lines, but if we picked it apart, you'd see that within the child rearing skills, there's things like treating bug bites. Another thing would be breastfeeding. Well, you're not going to be an expert breastfeeder as a post-reproductive adult, but maybe you're good at treating bug bites or something like that. So there's more to be said, by backing up from the averages and looking at the particular thing.
Yeah. So my
and also with the production, just real quickly, there's like leadership skills and directing others were some specifics I asked about, but then just working would be another thing, like carrying things or chopping down trees. So teasing these apart could probably reveal a lot of what your intuitions are pointing to.
And I think what you will see if you clarify it in that way is an even greater rightward shift in those curves, right? That is, once you subtract the sort of somatic or physical components of productivity from the activity, what you'll see is that the knowledge component takes time in most of these domains to acquire, and that you're underestimating that by combining it with the physical capacity.
Yeah, so I didn't split apart the child rearing, but I did with the food production skills and low strength and high strength, and we saw that those predictions fleshed out nicely. Yeah, so I totally agree with you, and there's good suggestions of future work to be done. I like when people point me to all the things I haven't done and I'd love to do. Yeah, thanks. Joe?
Thanks. So I have first an informational question, which then the answer to that becomes a precursor to the substantive question. The informational question is, are these the same people for whom Mike has the personality rating data?
I haven't joined up the data sets, and I'm sure for some of them, yeah,
Okay.
I'm sure. But some of the stuff doesn't join up so well, like food production data. Only like 24 people in my storytelling of the 54 we had the food production data from that point in time, and so that's why I wasn't able to include that in the storytelling analyses. Anyway, but so in some cases I don't have good matches, in other cases I do. But so if I did.
So I know that one of the dimensions that came out of that was this general industriousness personality dimension. But I'm wondering if that's equally strongly related to all the skills in all those things are like skills that some of those tasks are sort of more heavily weighted with just general industriousness, and others not so much. That's I mean, if you haven't concatenated the data sets, then I guess you can't sort of.
Yeah, but so when you think of industriousness, are you thinking of the production of like crafts and also food resources? Is that kind of what that would be? Like either wage labor or making things or producing food, all of that would be kind of linked to industriousness?
Well, that's,
okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
it's really purely empirical. I actually don't have any particular predictions, but I guess in a way what it's tapping is like what people are thinking of when they're when they're asked to rate themselves or their spouses. I think that was how the study was done on these general these sort of very general questions. Does this person work hard?
But that's kind of overall. I have this takeaway from a lot of different findings on this project, that there is variability in whether you want to call it industriousness or just overall competence across all things. And some people are just great at everything, you know? And those are also the people, like Mike has another nice paper in the past year, which is about looking at market integration, how that predicts other forms of productivity and food sharing. And he finds that the people who do more wage labor, they're also sharing out more food to everybody. And so they're just like, they're,
highly effective people.
Yeah, highly effective people.
But it'd be interesting to see whether there's a divorce there with regard to storytelling, because you might imagine that, the people who know all the stories, they're the people who spend a lot of time sitting around. That's how you learn all the stories, right? And that storytelling may not be classed as a
well, I did have
productive activity.
on the storytelling propensity, one of the last regressions, I did have the market integration. We saw that more market integrated people are also telling more of the stories they know. So they may just be more social, outgoing, gregarious, involved, less kind of sleeping in a corner by themselves type of people. So yeah.
And similarly, just very briefly following up on that, I mean, you had an age-sex interaction on telling stories, but not on knowing stories. But that's potentially
it was telling the stories you know.
But that's potentially explicable in terms of women's greater participation in the public realm postmenopausally when they. I mean, I don't know about Tsimane, but a typical pattern around the world is that they acquire more male-like social status, and so they become more gregarious and have more of a public presence and things like that.
Right, and there's a breakdown of this kind of separation of gendered domains, or a little more crossing over, right? So if there is a division of labor that kind of, because of social norms, maybe prohibits them from being really zealous about learning stories, they kind of compensate later when they feel more comfortable. Yeah, sounds good, please.
Kind of related to that topic, so your approach to storytelling was largely based on kind of a functional analysis of the costs and benefits of transmitting knowledge. I'm wondering if you could get more out of it by just thinking of it as an artistic performance, an opportunity for costly signaling of desirable traits, which might start to get at why the young men are perhaps engaged in some risky storytelling. They can't tell stories as well as the older people, but the young men try because they're trying to attract young ladies.
Yeah, and so you would, one thing that I would think, I mean, I've considered that because people like stories, they're, they enjoy, it's fun, right? So it's, you would also expect that maybe that village audience size, that people who had more potential recipients to hear them, that would kind of increase the propensity to tell stories, but we don't really see that.
Perhaps targeted on the males who are more likely to be signaling, then maybe you'd see an audience effect, whereas when it's purely about knowledge transfer, maybe it's more about kin or something, I don't know.
Yeah. And another thing, just, I guess maybe it's a little related, I was discussing with John Stieglitz yesterday over Skype. He's out in France, but he's working on submitting a paper which is about directed speech with kids, and basically the nutshell of his paper is that in this population there's very little directed speech. It's like a minute an hour you know, of like directed speech with like 1-year-olds, and it's way lower than what you see in other populations. And we started talking about when people are storytelling, who does it look like it's directed at? And so I don't have like, you know, hard data on this, but I reflected back on all the times I've hung out in households where people are storytelling, and you know, there's multi-generations there, and it's often the oldest person who's telling a story, but it's often the adults who are reacting and kind of interacting with the storyteller, and the kids are just passively mopping it up, you know. And so it's not like they're telling the stories to teach the kids, and like you know, a teacher at an elementary school teaches kids. So just something to keep in mind in the mix of how we're thinking about storytelling. Yeah. Any other comments or questions?
I have sort of a slightly off-target question, but I'm curious about the religion and to what extent the stories are communicating the religion. Your categories only showed a small percentage of them being original stories.
Yeah, so the Tsimane were contacted by missionaries a couple hundred years ago, and they've had conflicts with them and burned down churches, and there were murders and stuff. So there are some stories that have historical stuff about, you know, when the Familia Nate killed the priest and stuff like that. That's among the set of 120 stories. They also have a lot of stories that have, so I would say that what maybe you would call their religion, their spiritual belief system, has a lot of forest entities and spirits that are kind of stewards and managers of the flow of resources, and you have to, there's a lot of prohibitions and rules about proper behavior and improper behavior that can upset this god or goddess of the fish or the deer, that kind of thing. And so there's a lot of the stories are kind of encoding almost like a little bit of conservation culture of proper behavior, and the idea that, you know, you got to act in accordance with these norms to keep nature and its spirits happy. That's their form of religion, if you want to call it a religion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is that kind of
Yeah.
addressing your
Yeah.
question? Okay. Thanks, everyone.